Hello, lovelies, and welcome back. I'm Lex Carline, and this is Seriously Now. Now, first of all, I owe you all an apology. I am so sorry that there wasn't an episode last week. It all went sideways, story of my life. So rather than just rush it and to bosh out an episode, I figured I'd wait. And as some of you may have seen, we are now uploading on Thursdays instead of Tuesdays, and that's hopefully going to help me with my appalling time management. But we'll see about that one, shall we? Now, I did promise you a bit of a palate cleanser after Fred and Rose West, and that is exactly what we're going to have today. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most famous and expensive prisons in the world, or at least it used to be. Now it stands in ruins. I am, of course, talking about the Eastern State Penitentiary. It's a haunted world of cell blocks and empty guard towers, and it looms over the city of Philadelphia. The prison itself was open for just over 140 years, and it housed nearly 85,000 prisoners. And two of the more notorious of these prisoners are bank robber Slick Willie Sutton and Scarface himself, Al Capone. Now, the penitentiary was built on a farmland that was known as Cherry Hill, so its original name, can you guess what it was? Yes, Cherry Hill State Prison, which sounds quite nice, doesn't it? The prison opened on October the 25th, 1829, and it was originally around 2 miles outside of Philadelphia, but now, after decades of expansion, it actually sits in the heart of the city. The first prisoner was a man named Charles Williams, and there was a thorough description, and it even includes whether or not he was literate, and I've got it here for you. It says, burglar, light black skin, 5 feet 7 inches tall, foot 11 inches, scar on nose, scar on thigh, broad mouth, black eyes, farmer by trade, can read. Theft included one $20 watch, one $3 gold seal, and a gold key. He was sentenced to 2 years confinement with labour, and he was received by Samuel R. Wood, the first warden at the Eastern State Penitentiary. Now, before we go on with the tale, we're going to go back a little bit first, because this one was the first of its kind, and just want to show you how they got there, really. So early jails were often squalid, dark, and rife with disease. They were either cellars or underground dungeons, and even rusty cages served as some of the first enclosed cells. Detention was not seen as a form of punishment. No, it was just a tool of necessity while you were awaiting trial or transport. However, corporal punishment would often be used, so flogging, maiming, branding, if you've ever smelt burnt flesh, it's not pleasant, or putting them in the stocks. But people began to question the nature of prisons and what their purpose really should be. So Dr. Benjamin Rush, along with others, began to reform the harsh, inhumane conditions and created the new penal code. Harsh punishment was turned to hard labour, and in 1776, Walnut Street Jail was built to combat the appalling conditions of Philadelphia's Old Stone Jail, but unfortunately, it ended up basically being no better. Its conditions were also disgraceful, and along with the public reaction of prisoners working out on the streets, this led to the creation of the Philadelphia Society, and they were there to alleviate the miseries of public prisoners, whose goal was to correct issues in prison, so the start of the reform system. But they didn't take age, gender, or seriousness of crime into account. So everybody was just lumped together. You can imagine how well that didn't go. The Philadelphia Society was officially founded in 1787 by Dr. Benjamin Rush, and it was one of the world's first prison reform groups. You might recognise this next name, but Benjamin Franklin joined soon after. The group began looking into Walnut Street Jail and was suitably horrified at the conditions, and the group produced an account of findings to the legislature the following year. They recommended hard labour and also solitary confinement as effective strategies for reform. Okay. They thought that being alone would give adequate time to be with your thoughts, and that feeling truly alone and to reflect on your actions would therefore lead you to reform your ways. The logic's there. So in 1790, 16 single cells were built in Walnut Street Jail to test the effectiveness of 24-hour solitary confinement. How do you think you'd cope? I think I'd be all right for a day or two, maybe more, because I'm quite content on my own and can literally stay in the house for days. But I think after that the walls would start to close in on me big style. No thanks. But anyway, this was only the beginning. The Philadelphia Society would finally receive funding after many, many years of lobbying from the Pennsylvania legislature, and this was to build a new prison in 1821. And what would become the Eastern State Penitentiary would be a new type of prison. It would have solitary confinement for all of the 250 prisoners it was set to house, and it was argued by many that this was actually the world's first penitentiary. And in case you didn't know, the word penitentiary comes from the Latin, I'm going to butcher it, penitenia, which means repentance. The prison was costly, which back then it cost around $780,000, which from what Google tells me is around the 20 million mark today. A competition was held to design the penitentiary, and 4 architects submitted plans. John Haviland, who was a British man who'd settled in Philadelphia, won the $100 prize. Another man who had entered, William Strickland, was chosen to oversee construction, so he got a job too. Bonus. In 1821, the building work would start. Unfortunately, Strickland was fired a year later and replaced with one of the other competitors. Before the Eastern State's conception, solitary confinement was not really used as general practice, and this would be the first time it was instituted in full force. As I said, each of the 250 prisoners would have their own cell for the duration of their sentence. The cell entrance had a small doorway, meaning they would have to stoop or bow when entering, and some say as if to show respect to a higher power, to enforce a penitent attitude, or at the very least to slow them down if they're trying to escape and riot. The architect said that the vaulted ceilings and skylights not only let in God's light, but his wisdom to shine down on the prisoners. Some nice symbolism, each to their own. Now, as part of the solitary experience, I suppose, it was made sure that the prisoners couldn't see each other, and barely even the guards. The cells would have feed doors, and yes, they are exactly as they sound, and they also had their own personal exercise yards, which they were permitted to use for 30 minutes twice a day. The staff used a rotation system, so no 2 neighbouring prisoners would be out at the same time. Many would go years without seeing the face of another prisoner. So for the other 23 hours of the day, prisoners would spend it in their cells sleeping, eating, or engaged in honest work, such as repairing shoes, caning chairs, weaving fabric, or dyeing cloth. The only people the prisoners could speak to were the guards or the prison chaplain, and they were supposed to remain silent for the rest of the time. That would be difficult for me. Prisoners were also only removed from their cells to bathe every 2 to 3 weeks, so I bet it smelt wonderful. Ooh. Now, when even the White House didn't have indoor plumbing, yep, you guessed it, the Eastern State had running water and flushing toilets, so the prisoners were getting it better than the Prez. No, there was no cooling system, so no aircon. But in winter, hot water was piped in to provide little relief from the rather cold winters in Philly. Again, better than the White House. The penitentiary is designed in what's called a wagon wheel layout, and it was meant to be 7 single-storey cell blocks extending out around a central point so that guards would always have a clear line of sight, well, pretty much of the whole prison. There are pictures online if you want to go and have a look. It is a very interesting looking building, but I will try and add some on the socials for you. Now, only 2 cell blocks had in fact been completed by the time the prison opened, just less than a week shy of Halloween, the best time of the year. Cell block 3, which was the last of the original single stories, was completed in 1831, so just 2 years after the prison opened. From then on, due to the rapidly expanding prison population, the cell blocks were built with 2 or more stories. Blocks 4 to 7 were completed in 1835, and given the fact that they've got heating and running water when even the president didn't, you can almost see the appeal of being in prison as to why the population suddenly went boom. But still, the solitary, is it worth it? Now, when it was finally completed, the Eastern State Penitentiary spans 11 acres and 450 single-heated cells, all with running water and state-of-the-art sewage systems. It was often called both a technological and architectural marvel. But, dun dun dun, that doesn't mean that all was well within the prison. By 1877, they needed 4 new cell blocks to be built. The private exercise yards would be eliminated. They would all exercise together now, but the prisoners were still required to wear masks and be silent when doing so. Fun. I know it's not meant to be. It's prison, but still. And then by 1911, yet even more space was needed. So Block 12 was built between Blocks 6 and 7 from reinforced concrete, and this one was 3 stories high with 40 cells on each story. Block 12 had no skylights or arched ceilings, just narrow little windows. I suppose your skylight would have made it slightly more bearable, but fuck that. Prison is not for me. Even with the sleep, free food, it's not for me. And hopefully it's not for you either. So there's a little bit of uncertainty as to when Block 13 opened. It's somewhere between 1909 and 1926. Just a little window. And we don't really know much about its early use, but one thing we do know is that this is where most of the punishments were dealt. It was known as the Hole or the Klondike, which is 10 dark, poorly ventilated cells with iron beds. Ouch. And the cells were tiny. They were about half the size of normal prison cells, which at the penitentiary were only 8 by 12 feet, and often these hole rooms didn't have enough room to stand up straight. Now, I can feel the claustrophobia already. I suppose you'd be alright if you were short. Unsurprisingly, this would be considered inhumane today. The last block to be built was Block 14, and that was in 1926. This one was also 3 stories high, and it used up the last remaining space between the other blocks. So, Eastern State Penitentiary was originally built to house 250 in single cells, now housed around 1,700. The individual cells were rammed with 2, 3, sometimes even 4 inmates. Imagine bunking up with that many people, even one other person in a cell that's only 8 by 12 feet. Wah! At least you got company. So as we've seen, the penitentiary went through many changes in terms of new blocks and basically cramming in prisoners wherever they could. But another big change came after Warden Michael J. Cassidy died. His office space was enormous and could clearly serve a better purpose for the prison. So the warden's office was then moved into the administration building, and this allowed the religious staff, Protestant, Catholic and Jewish chaplains to move into the old office space. Then, in what was possibly a first in an American prison, Eastern State Penitentiary built a synagogue in 1924, and it was a staple of the penitentiary's religious community for the duration of its use. Well, with such a spiritual outlook, divinity-inspiring architecture, you'd think that it would be ideal for reforming prisoners with religion. And in 1955, one prisoner was in fact saved this way. Lester Smith, who had several convicted armed robberies under his belt, converted to Catholicism. The Bible was the only book available to read, and he read the scripture and he painted, something that he taught himself to do. One day the chaplain saw him painting his cell and invited him to come and decorate the offices where the priest would meet and counsel his prisoners. Smith accepted. Well, gets you out of your cell, so bonus. And that same year, 1955, he painted 12 beautiful murals. The penitent prisoner is said to be the most striking, and it's a kneeling prisoner seeking forgiveness from God. Again, I'll try and link some of the pictures, but they are pretty spectacular. Obviously, during its time, Eastern State was home to a whole manner of different prisoners. And what is a prison without some of its most famous inmates? Well, as we've said in this case, one of them, and probably the most famous, was Chicago gangster and real-life Scarface Al Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on the 17th of January, 1899, and he gained notoriety during the Prohibition era as the co-founder or boss of the Chicago outfit. Remember, the Prohibition era, no booze. Or supposedly no booze, because as we saw with the Michael Malloy case, wasn't exactly effective. Now, the Chicago outfit was, and potentially still is, an Italian-American organised crime family. On May the 17th, 1929, Capone was returning from a trip to Atlantic City, but it was cut short. He was arrested outside a cinema for carrying an illegally concealed and unlicensed .38 revolver. The Philadelphia courts gave him the maximum sentence of 1 year inside. I'm assuming that they wanted to use anything they could on him, and also to make an example. But Eastern State Penitentiary actually treated him like a VIP. Capone's cell had lavish furniture, rugs, paintings, and even a radio he used to listen to waltzes. They do run tours at the penitentiary now, and Capone's cell is actually set up as it allegedly was when he was there. Looks quite cushy even by today's standards. Now, it's said that Capone wasn't actually that eager to get out of prison, because his incarceration had lined up with an increase in mob violence, and he was even accused of hiding in prison. Big bad Capone? Hiding? Surely not. He naturally denied that this was the case, because he wasn't going to admit it. But he did spend thousands trying to get out early. Capone was then released on March the 17th, 1930, after 9 months, and he did get out on good behaviour. Another of the very high-profile prisoners at Eastern State was bank robber Willie Sutton. He was also known as Slick Willie, the actor, and the gentleman bandit. He spent his early adulthood using disguises and his charm to rob banks. But funnily enough, he wasn't always successful and had been arrested multiple times. One example was in 1934, where he used a machine gun to rob the Philadelphia Corn Exchange. Not only was he an accomplished thief, but he was also somewhat of an escape artist and tried somewhere around 5 times during his stays at the Eastern State. In 1953, Sutton wrote an autobiography called Where the Money Was, and it talks about one of these attempts. Now, he tries to take credit as the mastermind for this, but in reality, this was actually the work of 12 men, and they were led by Clarence Kleindienst, also known as Clinny. Now, Clinny was a plasterer, a stonemason, burglar, and forger, and he was also known to be a top-notch scavenger. A direct quote from Sutton was that if you give Clinny 2 weeks, he could get you Ava Gardner, and she was a famous actress who was also married to Frank Sinatra for a while. And then he goes on to say, if you give Clinny a year, he could get you out of prison. So Clinny came up with the idea to dig a tunnel to escape. Just like in the movies, 12 men would take it in turns to dig said tunnel from cell 68 using tin cans and spoons. They would work in teams of 2, doing 30-minute stints, and slowly built an opening through the wall and into the ground, removing the dirt in their pockets and shaking it off in the yard. Any of you have seen Shawshank Redemption? Yes, like that. Amazingly, the opening would avoid detection during cell inspection several times, and this was thanks to a panel that Clinny had made that matched the cell walls. Good effort, lads. A for effort. They even reinforced the tunnel with scaffolding and illuminated it, so it was quite the piece of engineering. Now imagine what these men, Clinny especially, could have been capable of if they'd applied themselves to something a little less illegal. The mind boggles. Somehow the men even managed to avoid foul smells coming through the tunnel entrance into the prison once they'd connected to the sewer line. And after many, many months, the tunnel was 38 inches wide and reached 100 feet beyond the prison's walls. With tin cans and spoons. Shows if you set your mind to something. So finally, they were ready to escape. And on the morning of April the 3rd, 1945, the 12 men snuck away to cell 68 on their way to breakfast. Unfortunately, all of that hard work would not pay off. Which, a little bit gutted for them. They tried so hard. Half of the men would be caught the same day, and the rest would be recaptured within a few months. 2 escapees, including Sutton, were caught within 3 minutes of freedom. 3 minutes. They were sent to the hole, which by then was dark. Well, it was always dark, but by then it was very overcrowded. Even Clinny only managed 3 hours himself before he was caught. So it's safe to say that their tunnel escape was a bust. The tunnel would be filled with ash and covered with cement. And, oh, how devastated would you be if you were one of the 12? Not only did you fail at escaping, but all that hard work is just undone, just like that. Although I suppose it wouldn't all be for nothing. Willie Sutton was transferred to Holmesburg Prison, which was said to be inescapable. Or not, because in 1947, Willie and a few others, using guard uniforms, one real pistol and one wooden dummy, broke out. But this time, Sutton remained free for about 5 years before he was captured by police in Brooklyn. Now, the Eastern State Penitentiary kind of set a bit of a blueprint, and the prison was copied by around 300 other prisons worldwide. And in the 1830s and 1840s, visitors actually flocked to see it in amazement. One of these such visitors was Charles Dickens in 1842. Yes, that Charles Dickens. But after seeing the living conditions for himself and speaking to some of the prisoners whose minds were already very fragile, he came away appalled and wrote that solitary confinement is a torturing of the mind that is much worse than any physician punishment that can be administered. He was not the only one. And investigations into the prison's finances, punishment practices and deviations from the Pennsylvania system have actually been going on for years. Thankfully, solitary confinement, in this sense at least, was abandoned in 1913. But realistically, this system had broken down long before this. Given that the cells were no longer individually occupied, they now broke down their prisoners in other ways, because of course they do. In the 1920s and 30s, Warden Herbert Hardboiled Smith, as they called him, ruled with an iron fist. And some of his favourite ways to break prisoners included periods of induced starvation, lashings with a leather belt, the water bath, which is where inmates would be dunked in a bath of ice-cold water, or have ice-cold water poured on them, and then they would be hung from the wall for the night. And it was particularly popular in the winter when the water would freeze to the skin. Whoa, no. Then there was the mad chair, and you would be strapped tightly to a chair with pretty much any movement restricted, and then you'd be left there, sometimes for days. There were even prisoners that lost limbs because of the mad chair when their circulation didn't return. Fuck that. No. That would break my brain. I couldn't be that still for that long. No. And then finally, there was the iron gag. So with the iron gag, an inmate's hands were tied behind their back and strapped to an iron collar in the mouth. So whenever they moved, it would cause the tongue to tear and bleed. Lovely. I'd love to know who comes up with these things. If we tie their hands behind... No. How do you get to there? Now, prisoners would obviously let their feelings be known about Smith's rule of terror, and they would riot over the conditions, their low wages, lack of recreational facilities, and so on, because there was a lot to complain about. The riots would be shut down with force, and the hole was another popular form of punishment. Now, during Smith's tenure, the state would only send prisoners to Eastern State who needed Smith's fierce reform tactics, which is slightly ironic because the reason that Eastern State Penitentiary was created in the first place was because people had felt the current punishments were too harsh. So, how did the Eastern State Penitentiary, which inspired so many, fall apart? Well, it actually lies in its creation. The Pennsylvania prison system, also known as the separate system, became too costly. With each prisoner having their own cell, own exercise yard, food delivered individually, it's just not practical, especially with the sheer volume of prisoners they ended up with. Prisoners would say that they didn't just feel isolated, but that it felt like no one else even existed. Everything was done alone, and they weren't even allowed to speak to themselves. Now, I talk to myself all the time. Yes, out loud. So, God, I'd be stuffed. But could you imagine just being completely silent all the time? Like, literally drowning in silence. Guards would wear covers on their shoes so that they didn't make too much noise walking down the corridors. And when prisoners were allowed to leave their cells, they would have a hood placed over their head so they couldn't see anything. It is just pure psychological torture. Imagine that for years at a time. If you weren't crazy when you went in. Now, obviously, the Philadelphia Society meant well, and they genuinely believed that what they were doing was in the best interests of the prisoners. But with what we know today, it was actually the complete opposite. Humans are social creatures. Well, for the most part, anyway. But it's a widely known fact that we have a fundamental need for connection. Social isolation and sensory deprivation were linked with slowed brain activity, and we knew this even as far back as 50 years ago. 50, yeah. It's now said that even 1 week in solitary can cause significant changes in the brain, damage to memory, learning ability and awareness. Which, when you think Charles Bronson, if you've heard of him, we will cover him at some point, has spent much of his almost 50 years inside in solitary. Well, I mean, he's got brain to study anyway, but imagine now. Wow. Anyway, more on him another time. So, what if prisoners already had existing mental health conditions? Obviously, we weren't as aware of it back then as we are now, but I would imagine a lot of them going in there did, and it's only going to make them worse and then potentially lead to other mental illness because anxiety, psychosis and depression became very common, and that's just to name a few. But thankfully, the Pennsylvania system, for many reasons, was abandoned. Woohoo! It would be replaced, however, by the Auburn system from the Philadelphia Society. Now, it originated in 1819 in Auburn, New York, and it had prisoners eating and working together, but they still weren't allowed to speak during those activities, because they also believed, and quite rightly, that the prisoners had the potential to corrupt each other, which is a no-brainer. Well, we all have the potential, but if you're already predisposed to it... So yes, you can see people during the day, you just can't talk to them. Still kind of torturous, but... Then they were back into their solitary cells overnight. Unfortunately, at Eastern State, many of the prisoners did choose to end their lives because of the appalling conditions. Unsurprising, but still fucking awful. The Pennsylvania legislature recommended abandoning the penitentiary in 1945, and it was followed by investigations that lasted until around 1959. But the penitentiary stayed open, and in 1961 there was a bit of an incident that all but sealed the fate of the penitentiary. John Klausenberg, who was a prisoner, tricked a guard into opening the cell of another prisoner, Manuel Madronal, and with both of their cells open, the two overpowered the guard and started the largest riot in the prison history. It took several hours, but a large force of police officers, guards, and state troopers did take the prison back, and this did fuel talks to close the Eastern State Penitentiary for good. But in 1965, the federal government designated it as a National Historic Landmark. But just 5 years later, in January of 1970, it closed for good. Most of the prisoners were sent over to the State Correctional Institution at Graterford, although for a period in 1970 to 1971, prisoners from Holmesburg were housed at Eastern State following a riot. Thinking that the building could be redeveloped for commercial use, in 1980 the city of Philadelphia bought the building from the state of Pennsylvania for just $400,000. Remember how much it cost to build 100 years before? Over 100 years before. Now, 1988 would see the Eastern State Task Force being formed, and this comprised of architects, preservationists, and historians. Mayor Wilson Goode actually urged the Redevelopment Authority to reject any proposals for commercial use, and it was also this year that the first limited group tours began. And as a fun fact for you, today the tour is narrated by Steve Buscemi. Fantastic actor and director. If you don't know who he is, you need to go and find him. He is just brilliant. The first Halloween fundraiser would take place at the Eastern State Penitentiary in 1991, and it was on Halloween night with the aim of raising funds to create a daytime tour program. Hundreds attended, and it has now become an annual tradition. Trip, anyone? Now, originally, guests had to sign a liability waiver and wear hard hats to go inside, which kind of makes me want to go more, but that is no longer the case. Now, this episode wouldn't be complete without talking about some of the paranormal activity that is said to take place. Although there were no executions, there were plenty of suicides and even a few murders. So, what might you find? Well, dating back to the 1940s, both guards and inmates reported strange sounds, peculiar sightings, and other eerie events. Experts in the paranormal have studied the prison on countless occasions, and many consider it to be one of the most haunted places in America, which is quite a title. According to the penitentiary's website, it has been featured on Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, Paranormal Challenge, Most Haunted Live, World's Scariest Places, America's Ghost Hunters, and Fear. So, quite popular. Now, cell block 12 is known for echoing voices and cackling. And Sci-Fi's Ghost Hunters revealed what appeared to be the apparition of a man walking through cell block 12. And a crew for Travel Channel's Most Haunted recorded objects moving on their own. Investigators with the production claimed to have communicated with multiple spirits. Friggin' cool. Cell block 6 is known for shadowy figures darting along the walls, and cell block 4 for visions of ghostly faces. Some guests have claimed to get a glimpse of a man standing in a guard tower on the property. However, there's no way to physically get to the top of the tower today because the brick stairs crumbled away years ago. Doo-doo-doo-doo. Other employees and tourists have heard whispering, giggling, and even weeping while exploring the property. But yet, when they investigate where the noises are coming from, they never find the source. The apparition of a mysterious woman is spotted so often that employees have actually given her a name. They call her the Soap Lady. Not sure why they've given her that name, but she sits in the last cell on the second floor wearing white, and the second floor was the women's cell block. Yeah, Soap Lady. Well, at least it wasn't the White Lady, because God knows how many of those are floating around. Floating. Sorry. Now, even Scarface himself couldn't escape the prison's powerful spirits. And whilst Capone lived, basically like a king in prison, an unseen presence terrified him at night, and he would often let out blood-curdling screams in the darkness, begging for someone named Jimmy to leave him alone. Many believe that Jimmy may have been the spirit of Jimmy Clark, who was one of the many men killed by Capone's execution orders in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Even after Capone was released from the Eastern State Penitentiary, the entity apparently continued to torment him, and out of desperation he even hired a medium. But unfortunately, that didn't seem to work. He eventually completely lost his mind and ended up in a mental institution for the final years of his life. Looks like Jimmy got the last laugh. So one of the most legendary tales of the Eastern State Penitentiary, Spook, comes from Gary Johnson, and he helps maintain the crumbling old locks at the prison. So in the early 1990s, he had just opened up an old lock in cell block 4 when he says a force gripped him so tightly that he was unable to move. He described it as a negative, horrible energy that exploded out of the cell. He said tormented faces appeared on the cell walls and that one form in particular beckoned to him. But tour guide Ben Bookman says, "It's a lot harder to find a believer than it is to find a skeptic here. We at Eastern State do not claim the prison is haunted. We run a haunted attraction." Bookman says that the staff do not like to exploit the prison's darker image, and most people making TV shows come in looking for ghosts, but that's not the story we tell. Inmates were real people. These were people's lives. Nearly 85,000 people spent time here. We're not going to glorify it, and we're not going to make fun of it. So, make of that what you will. Because that brings us to the end of the tale of the Eastern State Penitentiary. Is it somewhere you want to visit? Let me know. As always, you can find me on the socials at Seriously Now Pod, and for your content requests, Seriously You stories, or general feedback, it's seriouslynowpod@gmail.com. Thank you guys for joining me this week, and until next time, remember, Thursdays, stay safe, stay free, and stay weird. Bye-bye.